The instant empath attack is not when an empath becomes cruel. It is when their heart finally stops volunteering to be wounded in the same place. There's a moment in an empath's life that looks quiet from the outside, but inside something sacred has changed forever. They do not scream. They do not beg. They do not write the long message. They do not try to make anyone understand. They simply become still. And that stillness frightens people who were used to reaching them through guilt, silence, confusion, and emotional chaos. Because when an empath finally stops caring, they do not stop having a heart. They stop handing that heart to people who kept proving they did not know how to hold it. And that is the part most people misunderstand. The empath does not detach because they are evil. They detach because they are exhausted. They detach because they have explained the same pain too many times. They detach because they have forgiven without change, waited without proof, loved without safety, and carried emotions that were never theirs to carry. The world thinks an empath stops caring suddenly, but the truth is an empath stops caring slowly, silently, invisibly after 1,000 small moments where their soul kept whispering, "This is hurting me," and nobody listened. At first, they tried. They always try. That is the tragedy and the beauty of the empath. They try to understand, they try to soften, they try to forgive, they try to see the wound behind the behavior, they try to believe the apology, they try to make the connection safe. They try to explain their heart in a way that does not make the other person feel attacked. But one day the trying stops, not because the love was fake, because the love was becoming self-betrayal. That is the instant empath detach. It is not instant because the pain happened in 1 second. It is instant because the final realization arrives all at once. One moment they are still hoping. The next moment they see the whole pattern, the apology and the repetition, the promise and the behavior, the sweetness and the silence, the affection and the control, the soft words and the same wound returning again. And once an empath sees the pattern clearly, something inside them refuses to unsee it. That is when the first rare trait appears. When an empath finally stops caring, they become silent without becoming bitter. This silence is different. It is not the silence of weakness. It is not the silence of fear. It is not the silence of someone waiting to be chased. It is the silence of someone who has finally realized that their words have been falling into a place where accountability never grows. There was a time when they would have explained everything. They would have written the long message, the careful message, the message where they say, "I am not trying to hurt you. I just want you to understand." They would have made their pain soft. They would have removed the sharp sentences. They would have apologized for being emotional. They would have tried to prove they still cared while describing the wound someone else created. When an empath stops caring, they no longer turn their pain into a presentation. They no longer stand in the courtroom of someone who keeps pretending not to understand. They no longer beg for their feelings to be believed. They become quiet. And the people who depended on their explanations feel that silence like a locked door, because as long as the empath was explaining, there was still hope. As long as they were upset, there was still emotional access. As long as they were asking why, there was still a part of them trying to save the connection. But when the empath becomes calm after being hurt repeatedly, be careful. That calm may not be peace inside the relationship. It may be acceptance that the relationship has already shown them what it is. This is why their silence feels so final. It is not empty. It is full of everything they no longer have the energy to say. They do not stop caring because they never loved. They stopped caring because they cared so deeply that caring without change became unbearable. And this is the second rare trait. When an empath finally stops caring, their nervous system stops chasing. That is a powerful moment because before detachment, the empath's body may have been trained to run toward emotional distance. Someone became cold and they chased warmth. Someone went silent and they chased clarity. Someone changed tone and they chased reassurance. Someone pulled away and they started scanning their own behavior, wondering what they did wrong. That was not weakness, that was survival. Some empaths learned early that love could disappear without warning, so their nervous system became alert. It learned to read faces, measure tone, study silence, and detect emotional weather before the storm arrived. It learned that if they could sense the shift early enough, maybe they could fix it before they were abandoned, blamed, ignored, or misunderstood. But healing teaches the body something new. Not every silence is your assignment. Not every distance is your fault. Not every mood requires your repair. Not every person who pulls away deserves to be chased. When the empath finally stops caring, the body still notices the silence, but it does not run into it. The chest may still tighten, but the hands do not reach for the phone. The mind may still remember, but the soul no longer obeys panic. They feel the old pull, but they do not let the pull become a decision. That is detachment, not numbness, discipline. Imagine the phone lighting up after days of confusion. A message appears, something vague, something soft, something designed to test whether the old access still works. I miss you. The old empath would have melted into the memory. They would have searched the words for meaning. They would have wondered if this was finally the moment. They would have answered quickly, carefully, tenderly, because a part of them still wanted to prove the connection mattered. But the detached empath reads the words and asks a different question. Is this repair or is this just access returning? That question changes everything, because not every I miss you means I am ready to love you better. Sometimes it means I miss the version of you that answered. Sometimes it means I miss the person who carried my chaos. Sometimes it means I miss the door that opened whenever I knocked. Sometimes it means I miss being able to disturb your peace and still be welcomed back. The empath feels this now, so they pause. They do not hate. They do not attack. They do not perform indifference. They simply no longer chase the emotion. Their nervous system starts choosing peace over panic. That is rare. Most people react from fear. The old empath reacted from guilt, but the detached empath responds from clarity. They can feel someone's distance and still not abandon themselves to close it. They can miss someone and still remember the pattern. They can love someone and still refuse the access that keeps damaging them. This is the third rare trait. When an empath finally stops caring, memory becomes stronger than fantasy. Before detachment, empaths often survive on potential. They see who someone could be. They remember the tender moments, the rare softness, the night the person opened up, the apology that sounded real, the look in their eyes that made the empath believe, there they are, that is the person I knew was inside. And because empaths can see the wounded child inside others, they often stay longer than anyone else would. They think maybe they are afraid, maybe they do not know how to love, maybe they push people away because they have been hurt. Maybe if I am patient enough, safe enough, gentle enough, loyal enough, they will become who I know they can become. But when the empath finally stops caring, fantasy loses power. They no longer let one beautiful moment erase a repeated pattern. They remember the whole story, not just the apology, the behavior after it, not just the affection. Because the silence that followed, not just the promise, the broken rhythm, not just the wound behind the person, the wounds that person kept creating in them. This is where the empath becomes hard to manipulate, not because they become cruel, because they start remembering accurately. They stop editing the story to protect the image of someone who kept damaging their reality. Potential is beautiful, but pattern is reality. And you do not live with someone's potential. You live with their pattern. That realization can feel like grief, because the empath is not only letting go of a person, they are letting go of an imagined future. They are letting go of the version they defended, the version they waited for, the version they kept seeing beneath the damage, the version they believed love would eventually bring forward. But grief is not a sign that detachment is wrong. Sometimes grief is the sound of illusion leaving the body. And once the illusion leaves, the empath becomes peaceful in a way that cannot be forced. They stop asking, what if they change? And they begin asking, what is the pattern right now? They stop asking, do they have good in them? And they begin asking, does that good make me safe? They stop asking, do I still love them? And they begin asking, does loving them require abandoning myself? That last question can set an empath free, because the detached empath is not heartless. They may still care, they may still understand, they may still see the pain in the other person, but their memory is no longer weaker than their compassion. Their compassion no longer deletes the evidence. Their tenderness no longer covers the truth they remember, and that memory becomes protection. This is the fourth rare trait. When an empath finally stops caring, their boundaries no longer need a full explanation. This is one of the clearest signs that the empath has changed. Before detachment, they explained every boundary like they were asking permission to have one. They would say no, then apologize. They would step back, then give a full emotional report. They would ask for space, then reassure the other person 20 times. They would try to make the boundary painless for the person who made it necessary. But the detached empath understands something deeply. A boundary is not a debate. A boundary is not a request for approval. A boundary is not a speech that must convince someone to respect you. A boundary is a truth your behavior protects. So when someone tries to pull them back into guilt, drama, or over-explaining, they no longer open the whole wound again. They give one calm sentence. I understand how you feel, but I am no longer available for this pattern. Then they stop. That sentence is simple, but it carries years of awakening. It says, I can understand you without returning to this cycle. It says, I can hear your feelings without making them my responsibility. It says, I can care without carrying. It says, I can love without losing myself. And then they let consistency speak, because the power is not in the sentence. The power is in what they no longer do afterward. They no longer explain until the boundary becomes weak. They no longer soften the truth until it disappears. They no longer reply to every emotional hook. They no longer rush back because someone acts wounded by the consequence of their own behavior. They no longer confuse guilt with guidance. This is why people who were used to the old empath become confused. They expected the paragraph. They expected the apology. They expected the emotional labor. They expected the empath to repair the discomfort. They expected access to the same soft place. But now the empath's peace has a gate, and the gate does not open for guilt. This is not cruelty. This is maturity. Cold does not mean cruel. Cold means they no longer burn themselves to keep emotionally careless people warm. Calm does not mean weak. Calm means their nervous system is no longer available for every storm. Uneachable does not mean broken. Uneachable means the old wound no longer answers the door. They did not lose your love. They lost access to your wounds. That is what happens when an empath finally stops caring in the old way. They stop caring in the way that destroyed them. They stop caring in the way that made their body tense, their mind restless, their spirit tired, and their identity smaller. They stop caring in the way that required them to explain, chase, absorb, apologize, rescue, and return. But they do not stop caring in the healthy way. They begin caring for themselves. This is the fifth rare trait. When an empath finally stops caring, they become peaceful, private, and selective. This is the stage that people often misunderstand the most. They say you are different. They say you are distant. They say you do not care anymore. They say you used to be warmer. They say you used to be there for everyone. And maybe they are right. The empath is different. The old version was loving, but unprotected, warm, but exhausted, understanding, but lonely, forgiving, but slowly disappearing. Present for everyone, but absent from themselves. The new version is quieter, not empty, private. They stop posting every feeling. They stop telling everyone what hurts. They stop announcing every decision. They stop letting unsafe people know where the soft places are. They stop sharing their energy with anyone who knows how to ask for it. Their circle becomes smaller. Their words become fewer. Their intuition becomes louder. Their life becomes calmer. And for the first time, they may feel something they never knew they were allowed to feel. Relief. Relief that they do not have to fix everyone. Relief that they do not have to answer every message. Relief that they do not have to prove they are good. Relief that they do not have to keep explaining the same wound. Relief that silence can be a home, not a punishment. Peace may feel strange at first, because if chaos has been familiar, peace can feel empty. If emotional chasing has been your normal, stillness can feel like loneliness. If you have spent years being needed, privacy can feel like invisibility. If you learned love through anxiety, calm can feel suspicious. But give it time, peace will begin to feel like safety. Privacy will begin to feel like self-respect. Selectiveness will begin to feel like freedom. Your body will unclench. Your sleep will deepen. Your thoughts will become yours again. You will stop living as if someone else's mood is your emergency. You will stop measuring your worth by how quickly you are chosen, answered, understood, or needed. And that is when you realize that Instant Empath Detach was not the end of your heart. It was the return of your life. There is a sacred difference between not caring and no longer caring. The healed empath does not stop caring about humanity. They do not stop being kind. They do not stop feeling deeply. They do not stop noticing pain. They do not stop loving truth, tenderness, beauty, and real connection. They simply stop carrying what belongs to people who refuse to carry themselves. They stop carrying guilt that was handed to them as control. They stop carrying silence that was used as punishment. They stop carrying relationships that only survive when they do all the emotional labor. They stop carrying the image of people whose patterns keep proving something different. They stop carrying the belief that being loving means being endlessly available. That is the detachment, not hatred, relish. And release can feel like becoming lighter after years of walking with invisible weight. You may still remember. You may still care from a distance. You may still hope people heal. You may still wish them peace. But you no longer make their healing your assignment. You no longer make their confusion your home. You no longer make their emotional unavailability a problem you must solve with more love. This is where the empath becomes deeply powerful, because their love becomes clean. Not desperate, not fearful, not attached to being chosen, not mixed with self-abandonment. Their love becomes something they offer where it is honored, not something they spill where it is wasted. And yes, some people will panic when they meet this version of the empath. The toxic person will panic because guilt no longer works. The fake friend will panic because access is no longer automatic. The emotionally unavailable person will panic because distance no longer creates chasing. The manipulator will panic because confusion no longer creates over-explaining. The person who took your softness for granted will panic because the door that once opened easily is now protected by self-respect. But the empath is not responsible for their panic. The empath is responsible for their peace. Remember that you are not responsible for someone's discomfort with your healing. You are not responsible for someone's anger at your boundaries. You are not responsible for someone missing the version of you that abandoned itself for them. You are not responsible for making your detachment easy for people who made it necessary. This is where many empaths need to be careful because guilt may return. It may whisper, maybe I am being too cold. Maybe I should explain again. Maybe I should give one more chance. Maybe they are hurting. Maybe they need me. Maybe I am selfish for choosing peace. When that guilt comes, do not shame yourself, but do not immediately obey it either. Ask yourself, am I being cruel or am I finally being consistent? Am I hurting them or am I refusing to keep hurting myself? Am I abandoning them or am I returning to me? Am I closing my heart or am I closing access to a pattern? These questions bring you back to truth because sometimes guilt is not your conscience. Sometimes guilt is the old programming that taught you to choose everyone else before yourself. Sometimes guilt is the echo of a role you no longer have to play. You do not have to be the endless forgiver. You do not have to be the emotional translator. You do not have to be the soft place for people who keep arriving with sharp edges. You do not have to be the one who understands everyone while nobody understands you. You do not have to keep proving your empathy by tolerating what keeps injuring your spirit. Your empathy is not measured by how much pain you can survive. Your goodness is not measured by how much disrespect you can explain away. Your love is not measured by how many times you return to a pattern that keeps breaking your peace. The detached empath understands this. And that understanding makes them almost impossible to control. They can still be kind, but kindness is no longer a doorway. They can still be soft, but softness is no longer permission. They can still forgive, but forgiveness is no longer automatic access. They can still listen, but listening is no longer emotional labor without limit. They become balanced, and balance can feel like betrayal to people who benefited from your imbalance. Let them feel what they feel. You do not need to turn back into the old you to prove that you are still loving. The old you is not more loving. The old you is more available to harm. The old you is not more loyal. The old you is more afraid of leaving. The old you is not more kind. The old you is more willing to disappear. And now you are done disappearing. This is what happens when an empath finally stops caring. They stop entering arguments designed to exhaust them. They stop replying to messages that only reopen the wound. They stop seeking closure from people who keep creating confusion. They stop confusing someone's pain with their responsibility. They stop treating potential like proof. They stop letting one soft moment erase a repeated pattern. They stop calling anxiety love. They stop calling emotional intensity depth. They stop calling self-abandonment loyalty. And slowly they come back to themselves. That return may be quiet. It may look like fewer messages, fewer explanations, fewer emotional reactions, fewer chances, fewer people close to them. But inside, it is not a loss. It is a rebuilding. They begin to feel their own energy again. They begin to hear their own thoughts. They begin to sleep without waiting for the phone. They begin to choose rooms where their body relaxes. They begin to enjoy silence that does not punish them. They begin to trust peace even when it feels unfamiliar. And eventually, they realize something beautiful. They did not stop caring. They stopped bleeding for people who only recognized love when it came with no boundaries. They stopped caring in the wounded way and started caring in the healed way. The wounded way says, I will lose myself so you do not leave. The healed way says, I will not leave myself to keep you. The wounded way says, I will understand your pain even when you keep causing mine. The healed way says, I can understand your pain and still protect myself from your pattern. The wounded way says, I will forgive you so the connection does not end. The healed way says, I can forgive and still let the connection change. The wounded way says, I need you to understand me so I can feel free. The healed way says, I understand myself now. And that is enough to begin. That is the transformation. And once the empath reaches this place, they become different in a way that cannot be reversed. Not colder, clearer, not cruel, calmer, not unreachable because they are broken. Unreachable because they finally belong to themselves. And when the next chapter begins, remember this. What people call the instant empath detach is usually the final moment of a long, invisible grief. It is the moment the empath stops trying to be understood by people who kept benefiting from their confusion. It is the moment they stop giving emotional access to patterns that never became safe. It is the moment they stop carrying the weight of connections that only survived because they kept disappearing inside them. The instant empath detach is not the death of love. It is the birth of self-respect. And when an empath finally stops caring in the old way, the world does not lose their heart. It loses access to the part of them that was willing to be hurt just to keep loving.